Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
All right, everyone, welcome back to Initiated Survivor. I'm really excited for our guest today. I'm sitting here talking with Rena Martine, and she is a women's intimacy coach. She has quite a really cool take on how to help survivors, and I'm so excited for this conversation. Welcome, Rena. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelsey.
Can you share a little bit about yourself and about how you got into this field?
Sure. So I spent 14 years as a deputy district attorney with the Los Angeles County DA's office and prosecuted sex crimes, child abuse, and domestic violence cases for the majority of my career. But I hit this breaking point there where I realized that there was only so much I could do to help folks in a broken system. And simultaneously, I was working through my own shame regarding sexuality, regarding the fact that I didn't necessarily want the conventional white picket fence of monogamy. I was married at the time. And so I went through years of a healing journey to get to a place where I could create a life that doesn't fit squarely within a box. And everything changed for me. And in that change, I realized I wanted to help other women reclaim that for themselves too. I made a really bold move, leaving an incredibly prestigious and stable career as a lawyer, as a trial attorney, to start my own coaching practice. And it's been wonderful. So I work with clients one-on-one. I also do some speaking. I have a book coming out next year, all the good things. And it's the most rewarding work I've ever done. Yeah. So that's a little bit about me.
That's so awesome. I think this idea that you're talking about for you, there was realizing that you don't really fit into the cookie cutter mold of what our dominant culture tries to impose on us, especially as women. And it was a healing journey to get to a place of saying, like, I actually can create something new. And I think, in my experience with my assault, it was like everything was shattered after that happened. And realizing that as I was putting stuff together or back together or rebuilding something, it was now seeing behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz and getting an idea of like, there's certain things about this that I don't like and I don't want to be a part of. And I've lived life where everything was totally in shambles and totally apart. And so I do not have to put everything back into that cookie cutter that felt restrictive. And at the same time, like, especially as a trauma survivor, and I think as women in general, women and femmes in our culture, there's also this messaging that the only way to really be safe in our culture is to conform. And so it feels like there's this big risk with it to carve that new life for ourselves. And I know many of my clients and survivors I talk to also kind of get stuck in this place of like, I don't even know where to start. Like, what are the options? When we say like, you could build anything, then they're like, I don't know that's too much space. So I'm really curious to hear more about, like, for you, how did you come around to creating a life for yourself? Like, where did those ideas come from? I assume it takes a lot of self-validation and self-affirming type of practices because it is really courageous in our culture to do something that's non-conforming. And so what were some of those things that were helpful to you with that?
So at the time, most of my community, so my friends, my family, my colleagues, were not affirming of sex positivity. We're not affirming of anything that didn't fit squarely in the hetero, monogamous, vanilla kind of box. And so what I started doing is I pulled up as many episodes from the Savage Lovecast, so Dan Savage's podcast, and just started devouring them. And there's so many great podcasts out there right now, but what I really appreciate about his is that he features people from all around the world and not just talking heads as experts discussing these things, but real stories from real people. And that made me realize that my people were out there, that I just needed to find them. And so I like to say I dropped a bomb in my life by ending my marriage, but then I got to design my dream home from the ashes of that. And a lot of it was trial and error. A lot of it was figuring out what I wanted by first identifying what it was I didn't want. I started off with a clear idea of, okay, I don't want this. I don't want what I've been doing. So let me just start from scratch. and start playing the sandbox a little bit and tried a few different things. Eventually met somebody who's been my partner now for almost 5 years who really enjoys coloring outside the lines as much as I do. And we're constantly renegotiating what our relationship structure looks like. We share very similar values. And so that's been beautiful. I'm still on my journey of sexual exploration because I don't think we ever end that journey. And part of what I love about being a coach is that I can so openly share that journey with my clients in a way that isn't necessarily allowed in the confines of conventional therapy or encouraged.
Yeah.
And again, because what I've seen from my own personal journey and now having coached and educated thousands of women is that when it comes to sex and intimacy, which is the most shameful and hidden part of who we are typically, that hearing stories from women like you, hearing stories from your people is so much more profound in terms of normalizing our own experience. And that was my journey. And I continue to leverage that. I will say I love therapy. I'm literally dedicating my book to my former therapist because she changed my life. But I'm chatty. I'm a talker. I'm like, let's pull back the curtain and I'm going to tell you all the nitty-gritty details about my life so that I can say, yes, I've been there. I have been there. And here's what I tried. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. And so that has been a way of practicing that's helped me a lot that kind of aligns with my own journey.
That's so awesome. And I love, there's so much I love about what you said. There's this way of talking about intimacy and sexuality and relationships more from like playfulness, the way you describe it, of like, this isn't necessarily a like figure something out about yourself and then you just do that forever and life is fine, but like more about openness and having a relationship that is open to that exploration into that ongoing negotiation and discussion so that there's curiosity and playfulness with it, which kind of brings in that joy and awe and wonder that people want to have, or that some people want to have. I know I want to have with that, those kinds of experiences. And there is so much power and value with our stories and our story sharing. Like, I think that's part of what made me want to share a podcast, was hearing other survivors talk about their recovery made me know not only that it's possible, but that the things that I'm feeling and that I'm thinking are normal or to be expected from this. And that the sense that I have about the world and about certain things that I've noticed is not unfounded, that this is something that's important. And I think that self-disclosure can be so powerful with that. And I know we talked a little bit about wanting to take a moment to differentiate between therapy and coaching and why both are so helpful. So therapy, I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist. Therapy is oftentimes primarily focused on that there is a mental health issue or a diagnosis or symptoms that need to be treated and intervened upon and changed in order for somebody to live the life that they want to be living. And therapists definitely do have some education, training, and skills that can do coaching. There are many therapists that do not have that training, education, and skills. And I think that's really important, that people automatically assume that because they're a therapist, they can do coaching. And I think that's actually really important to know that, that's actually a distinct skill set. But some therapists do, because they've gotten that training and education. They do have that skill set and they specialize in that. And that therapists are primarily looking at, like, how do we repair and heal trauma? How do we help somebody get out of depression? How do we help somebody manage anxiety? And my understanding is coaching is more looking at what is the life that you want to live and what skills do you need in order to build that and to continue building that. And many coaches are very specialized, like you're specialized in women's intimacy, that they have a specific, distinct expertise. They're not just like generally a coach for everything, that they know how to specifically help with this. And I think what can be so helpful for folks is that coaching can be a really great space where you get to focus on specific goals or barriers to living the life that you want to live that just doesn't feel like is appropriate for therapy, or you don't feel comfortable bringing it up in therapy. And especially because therapists definitely know how to help you with anxiety, depression, how to help with those symptoms and diagnoses, they don't necessarily know all of the things there is to know around building skill sets for women's intimacy. the way that a coach has an expertise specifically focused on that. Coaching can be such a powerful resource for people to be able to really build the life and learn the skills on how to build the life that they want to live. Where like therapy can be more about like, I need to be able to survive life. Coaching can be like, I now want to enjoy my life and bring that energy in. And so does that kind of resonate for you?
It does so much. And I think you so beautifully distinguish between those. An analogy that I use often is, say you got into a car accident and you messed up your knee, right? You might go to a physical therapist to get you to the point where you can resume your day-to-day activities. You can walk, you can drive, you can do all the things you used to do. But say you then want to run a marathon. You probably wouldn't go back to your PT, to your physical therapist for that. You might hire a trainer. You might hire a coach. And so, yes, we are definitely forward moving. The gist of coaching is, where are you now? Where do you want to be? And what's coming in the way of you getting there? And what I love too as a coach is that I can serve clients all around the world. I have a client in Malaysia right now. I'm based in Los Angeles.
Awesome.
I've worked with people in Tasmania, people in Europe, a ton of folks here in the US and Canada too. And so I have a little bit more flexibility in that regard. And I know that as therapists, you're stuck in the state or states that you're licensed in. And I'm also able to say, okay, so you're looking to go to a sex party. Here's a list of certain ones I can vouch for, other ones I've heard of, and really use a little bit of consulting in addition to my coaching, because consulting is basically, I know a little bit more about this than you do. So let me give you some resources, tangible resources, instead of saying, why don't you figure this out on your own type of thing? Not to say that all therapists do that, but
Right.
there's a little bit more overlap with, or there can be, with consulting and coaching at the same time. We're given the flexibility to really niche down. I always joke, any goal that you could possibly have in mind, there's probably a coach for it. It's beautiful that we just have so many helpers now in the world.
Yeah. And I think it's such a great way that we can build community in a system that really wants us to be isolated individuals, that if you want an expertise in something, you have to do it yourself or just kind of wish for a mentor and hope they show up. One of the thoughts I had, and I'm interested to hear what your take is on this or what your perspective is, that the mental health field right now is, and, has always had this problem with all of the biases, with white supremacy, colonialism, misogyny, all of that kind of stuff. It's still very ever present and very strong. It's really deeply embedded in the theory and techniques that we use as therapists, as well as our pathologizing method around understanding mental illness. And there's definitely therapists that are unlearning that system and learning how to come into more of this decolonized way of practicing with people, and more inclusive way of practicing with people. And like you brought up with some of those limits, like there's a lot of risks around what does that mean for your licensure and laws. And there's lots of examples of that we could go into at another time. I guess in my mind, and this maybe is an assumption on my part, that coaching, like coaches are human too, they're going to have their biases, but that it might actually be a lot easier to find a coach that is operating within the values that you have as a person, because they can be so specialized and they're very specific and distinct, and they're definitely self-disclosing more than therapists might. And that it might be easier for people to match up with someone as a coach that is not as burdened or not as colonized and not as perpetrating colonized therapy than it is with therapists. I think that there's a lot of therapists that have this perspective that they're an expert in everything, or they're supposed to be an expert in everything. And so clients have no idea who they're talking to until they're far into therapy. And at that point, there's just such a high risk of whatever happens in that therapy to be harmful if it ends up being harmful. And so when there's biases that are coming in, there's high potential for those biases to be harmful at that point. But with coaches, it seems like there's so much more opportunity for people to find somebody that shares their values, that is willing to discuss these things and be very clear about what their beliefs, limits, all that other kind of thing is, and what you can expect, what you're going to get from coaching, so that you can actually get access to similar support and help without as much of that colonized influence that psychotherapy has from our history and our roots. What are some of your thoughts on that? I like I said, I might be making an assumption, but
No, I think you're right. And not all coaches, just like not all therapists, are created equal, right? I am certified, and intersectionality was a huge emphasis in my certification program, right? So understanding where people are coming from, understanding and unpacking my own implicit biases that I may not have even known were there, but also being very upfront about my worldview and how I help people. Because I will often, during consultations with prospective clients, say to them, just so you know, I am not a spiritual sexuality coach. There are a lot of those out there. And if that's the lens that you're looking to approach your journey through, I am not the coach for you. I am evidence-based, have a background in positive psychology, but it's also the former lawyer in me. I want the data. I want the research. I want the neuroscience behind all of the methods I'm going to use with you. And that's what you're going to get from me. So I'm very much evidence-based, which is rare in the coaching world when it comes to sensuality, intimacy, and sexuality, because there's a lot of yoni eggs and sacred feminine energy. I mean, terms like this are so ubiquitous within the female sexuality coaching space that, right? And I tend to attract a lot of, I'll say, successful, high functioning women who tend to overfunction and who are prone to perfectionism and don't know how to let their guards down. That is a gross overgeneralization, but there is a type of woman who tends to come to me instead of other coaches. But also I work with a ton of trauma survivors too, because of my background as a sex crimes prosecutor, because I have dealt firsthand with the most vulnerable members of our population. And I have seen some of the most horrific acts imaginable. And so there's nothing that anyone is going to bring to me that's going to shock me. And I think that is so important when we're talking about something as vulnerable and perhaps as shameful as recovering from sexual assault or abuse. So yeah, I hear what you're saying in terms of there's red tape is what I'm hearing you saying it when it comes to therapy, and that it can be difficult to walk that tightrope and undo a lot of the systemic biases that are the bedrock of therapy as an institution. But I think therapy is so absolutely necessary. It's never going to be replaced by coaching, that both are necessary and both do different things, and they can work absolutely beautifully alongside each other or one after the other in sequence. But yeah, we're working with the systems as they currently exist and trying, I think, in our own respective ways to make those systems better. And I think we're on a good trajectory.
I hope so. I think we are. And I love the way, like, your journey too, of like being a DA for sex crimes and then now a women's intimacy coach, of like different ways that you're serving a community, like just different parts of the repair process. Like there's the justice seeking and the reparative process of that. And then the like reclaiming your life and your body. That's so key and so essential, that I think is really important and valuable. And it just means that you're just such a cool person to be able to see all parts of that and to be all parts of that for survivors to really access. And I also love evidence-based things. I'm very data-driven. I say it's because I'm a Virgo. So when you were like, oh, high-achieving, perfectionistic women seek me, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm being being called in here. Like,
well, I am one of those too.
Welcome to our club. With survivors of sexual trauma, when you're working with them, what are some of the things that really stand out to you as either like common themes or important stages for their reclaiming, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples, but what I'd say is a problem I see often is that my clients are avoiding their triggers. Like, I had something bad happen and therefore I don't want to date again. Or I am just going to be kind of celibate indefinitely and hope this thing gets better on its own. And the way that trauma and that our triggers work is that we can't think our way through them. We have to introduce that opposite action to create these new neural pathways that say, okay, That was then, and this is now. And that's really the journey that I walk survivors through, which is, okay, how can we start taking these little micro steps that say the world is a safe place? I'm not telling them, all right, you've been celibate for a year, you're going to go out and have sex tomorrow. Like, just to be clear, that's not what we're doing. But say, for example, I've had several clients who certain parts of their bodies were triggering because I will guide them through a self-touch process. It's totally G-rated, just so we're clear. And we do it over Zoom with our cameras off. For example, I had a client and she was getting triggered when she would touch her own thighs because she had survived repeated abuse by a tennis coach who used to pay special attention to her legs. And so she was shutting down during that. So what I told her was, okay, every day for the next week, I want you just on your own to spend 5 minutes just touching your own thighs and doing that. And if you start to shut down, stop for the day and try again the next day. And really just sending that new data, that new evidence to the brain that says this is okay. I worked with another client because I love to use BDSM as a healing modality too, but another client, she has been married for quite a while. Her husband's a great guy. And she could never receive oral sex because it was something that was performed on her against her will as a child. So what we did, and she was actually really excited about this, is she and her husband engaged in some pre-orchestrated like role play. She's like, all right, here's what I want to do. I'm going to pretend like I'm the CEO and you're the employee and you're coming in for your quarterly review and you've done such a bad job. And I'm going to request that you do this to me. And just doing that once completely changed everything for them. I'm still in touch with her. We worked together about 2.5 years ago. She's like, I love oral sex now. And I'm able to talk freely with my husband. We're in a better place than we've ever been. And that was through flipping the script, restaging the trauma and saying, okay, back then when this used to happen to me, I didn't have a say in this. But now I can restage this. I can introduce that opposite action. And I'm now in the director's chair. I'm orchestrating this. So those are just a few examples, but every woman is unique, which is why I can't give a cookie cutter approach. But it's a matter of isolating, okay, what was the traumatic event? What's triggering me? And how can I very gently start recreating that in a way that's changing the narrative around it? So we're setting the stage, but it's looking a little bit differently now.
That's so awesome. As a therapist, we sometimes do what we call in vivo exposure, which is kind of the same thing of like the things that you avoid. Let's practice and rehearse going in and facing those things. And many therapists will do that where they are alongside their client. But, you know, many therapists, and like with me, it's not alongside my client. Like we're giving them homework that they're practicing and they're going and doing it and then reporting back, and we problem solve from there. And I'm just like, so I was hearing you, I was like, oh my gosh, if we could join forces and have you be there in those moments, guiding the exposure, like the amount of progress people would make would be just like astronomical in such a fantastic way.
Just so we're clear, I was not in the room with them as they were doing any of this.
Not some of those more intimate ones, maybe the G-rated ones, but
yeah,
even just like the amount of detail that you can bring to how to set up exposures for people can be really powerful. That's a skill that like not many therapists have, and that we don't really, that some therapists have as a specialty, but not many therapists have that skill. And this is where coaching can be so powerful, is having somebody who's really skilled at supporting you in these exposures. And I want to talk about this. I know we talked about this previously, and it's something that I think can be really a very interesting topic, is the role of BDSM in recovery from trauma. And this isn't just like kind of an out of nowhere idea. There are a lot of survivors of sexual assault that find themselves interested in kink and BDSM and play as part of some of their reclaiming, or just as part of some of the ways that they're re-experiencing their bodies. And because of a couple of things, purity culture and all of the things that are terrible about purity culture and heteronormativity, as well as rape culture, that a lot of survivors feel a tremendous amount of guilt and shame around that. If I'm drawn to certain things, then what does that mean about who I am? Or what does that mean about my trauma and what happened at my trauma? And what does that mean about sex, like for me moving forward in my relationships? And so I wanted to hear from you about this, because it sounds to me like you have a way of bringing this process in that is actually healing and reparative for people, and really not just demystifies it, but destigmatizes it and makes it something that's more celebratory, which I would love to hear more about.
Yeah. And so if we're talking about a certain class of fantasy, and I'm going to throw some big ol' air quotes around the word rape. So rape fantasy, which really is just a consensual non-consent or a forced seduction fantasy. Kelsey, I get DMs from people on a weekly basis saying, what's wrong with me that I'm having rape fantasies and I am a sexual assault survivor? Because that can be so troubling. And I start off by normalizing and saying, well, actually, almost 2/3 of women have had forced seduction or consensual non-consent fantasies. That's what the data tells us on this. So they're quite common. And what's going on under the fantasy? So there are a few things that can be happening here. And one is that the fantasy is just about a form of submission, that I want to be perceived as so irresistible to somebody that they're overtaken with lust and desire for me. But it can also be this type of restaging. Like, this thing happened to me that wasn't my choice, but I'm fantasizing about me doing it again. Maybe it'll look a little bit differently where it is my choice. But I understand how paradoxical this can seem to people, how troubling it can feel to people. And so what I want to remind folks is that the reason this isn't actually a rape fantasy is that most of us women, I think I can speak for most of us and say, when we're walking alone at night down a dark street, we are not actually wishing in that moment that a stranger is going to jump out and sexually assault us.
Yeah.
Right. So this is play. This is pretend. This is us playing cops and robbers. This is not literally a bank robbery. But that still can be really offensive to people. I posted a TikTok recently because people wanted to know about DDLG, Daddy Dom Little Girl, or age play fantasies, and was accused of promoting incest and pedophilia. There's so few people who are willing to touch this and talk about this openly, despite how prevalent these fantasies are. I have a colleague, she's a PhD in trauma studies. She's a trauma professor. She's well known in the field. And she and I will collaborate on workshops on BDSM as a healing modality. And very few people with a PhD after their name are willing to publicly claim this because it's so provocative and inherently risky to talk about. And I'm here to normalize the discussion by talking about it. I'm very open about the fact that I am in a DS relationship, that we have an element of innocence play, that I have engaged in consensual non-consent. And it's been so healing for me. And so another part of what I do with my clients, even those who aren't assault survivors, is, okay, Rena, I think I'm curious about ethical non-monogamy. I'm curious about kink. How do I start designing this kind of relationship? And going in and figuring out what is the why behind it? Why does this interest you? And then diving deeper and coming up with a real clear roadmap for them. But in terms of how do you start doing this, if you're having these thoughts, get curious, almost like a scientist would, about the thoughts, about the fantasies. Say, okay, well, what is it about this? What is it about this? Don't be scared of them. Don't try to suppress them, because when we suppress our fantasies, they become psychological preoccupations, which is not good for us. But make friends with them and get curious about them. Obviously, if that feels too hard or overwhelming, seek out help for it. I mean, you and I, Kelsey, are two helpers here right now, but there are people out here who know about this stuff and who can help you. You don't have to do this alone.
Definitely. And I think what you're sharing is just so helpful and supportive, because it's not just like kind of totally destigmatizing this and saying there's a community for you and there's people who understand this, but also there's people who can guide you through this process so that it is safe, so that it isn't something that is just re-triggering trauma, but is actually something that does feel healing, reparative, playful, fun, whatever it is that you're wanting to feel. This is what you do. Like, this is how you help people, is by creating these scenes and helping them understand them in a way that makes it so that they can engage in them effectively for themselves. And I think anything that has us practice authority and power and consent and what happens to ourselves and our bodies is inherently healing for survivors.
Yeah.
Because it just continues to restore that sense of agency and power, but especially so around sexuality. And because and I've said this several times with folks that I've interviewed, that it's such a personal, intimate, vulnerable part of ourselves that then gets weaponized and used for violence. And it makes sense that we either want to completely sever ties, or we kind of go the other direction of hypersexuality. And it's kind of like we're trying to learn how to wield this weapon, but it's still a weapon. And that healing comes from actually coming back to ourselves and what our relationship is with our body and our sexuality, and what do we want from it, and having support from people that can create so much safety around what we're experiencing, so that we know it's safe to proceed in a way that it's not going to make things worse. It actually can not just make things better, but make things mind-blowingly better.
Yeah. Pleasure isn't just the absence of pain and discomfort. There's so much joy. And I firmly believe that sex is an adult form of play. But if you are a survivor, that is not the story that your brain believes to be true. And so how can we give it a new story to start chewing on, really?
Yeah, I like that. And writing your own story for it to chew on.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, I wanted to, because we're getting close to the end of our time, I wanted to make sure that people know exactly how to get a hold of you, because you're such an excellent resource, and what kind of work you offer for survivors. How would people be able to work with you? All that kind of stuff. What are some of your offerings? All of that.
Yeah. So my signature offering is an 8-week program called Shameless. I've had about 100 women go through this program. It's not a group coaching program. It's one-on-one, but we work together within an 8-week container. If you want to learn more about that, you can read about it on my website, which is renamartine.com. Or if you're like, I don't know yet, Rena, but something you said today resonated with me, and I just want to pop in and say hi, shoot me a DM on Instagram. My DMs are always open. I manage them myself, for better or for worse, but I love connecting with people. And so just shoot me a DM on there, and we can get the conversation going and see if I can support you and what the best method of support would look like.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to make sure to put all of your contact information in the show notes for this, so people can easily just link right into you as well. That's such an amazing offer. I hope everybody follows you and learns so much from you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved our conversation.